us started today. So thank you everyone for joining us in the third session of our community learning series for Child Abuse Prevention Month. I am Jill Walsh, the Program Manager at Prevent Child Abuse Georgia, and we are hosting along with the Prevention and Community Support section at Georgia DFACS to bring you the series throughout the month. And we have one more session next week, which is on civic lunch. Maybe you guys have done a civic dinner by now, but we're doing a civic lunch for next week, and we have information at the end of the session for that. But I wanted to introduce this session, which we're discussing racism. It's really baked in, and we have our presenter, Alex Cummerdale, who is a senior policy analyst at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. And he produces research that shows ways to reduce poverty, improve social services, and provide support for Georgia's workforce. And I'm going to put the rest of his bio, which is impressive, into the chat box, along with the reading again from this week. So we hope you guys had a chance to look at that policy brief that he co-authored at the end of last year and released. I just put it in the chat box again, so you can pull it up to have, or at least skimmed it, or maybe someone in your discussion group will have done it thoroughly. But I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Alex.
Wonderful, thank you, Jill. I'm about to share my screen here. All right, someone give me a thumbs up, you can see it. Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. Alex Cummerdale here with the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. For those who are unfamiliar with our agency, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and advocacy organization that's focused on expanding economic opportunity for all Georgians across the state. We've been around for about 16 years, and we're based in Atlanta, Georgia. But again, our focus is statewide, and budget is in our name. So we do a lot around advancing ideas around how to spend money wisely on programs and services that help children and families. But we also talk a lot about social policy in general and ways that we can improve public policies so that they can meet the ends of advancing prosperity in an equitable manner for everybody in the state. And one policy that I'm excited to talk with you all about today is one that is a little less known today compared to bigger programs, but it certainly has a long history in our state and nationally, and it's the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. The reason why, and I love the title, Racism It's Baked In, the reason why this is lifted up today is because it's one of the components of our social safety net that is truly imbued with racist attitudes and other issues that prevent people from getting access to cash assistance and thriving and rising above the poverty threshold. So I'm going to provide a pretty thorough overview for those who had a chance to glance at the report. Much of this is going to be familiar with you. I'm going to include some specific examples of how racism shows up in the Temporary Assistance for Needy program, and I'll refer to it as TANF from this point forward. And then we'll talk about some solutions further down the line, because I know that's something that you all are interested in supporting as well. So to get into it, why is cash important? So when we talk about TANF, we often talk about it in terms of just general welfare. At GBPI, we reimagine TANF as cash assistance, as direct cash support for families that are in deep poverty. And cash is one of the most effective ways to help people navigate poverty, especially those who are in deep poverty, which is 50% of the federal poverty, below the federal poverty level. And Georgia has historically had higher than average poverty rates, particularly among our child population. We know that children of color are disproportionately overrepresented in the poverty rate. 1 in 5 children in the state of Georgia are living below the poverty line. And the poverty is also concentrated geographically throughout the state. And as these maps on this slide indicate, are also corresponds with a region of our state known as the Black Belt. And for those who are unfamiliar with the Black Belt, it is a region where there is a greater share of the Black population in predominantly rural counties that spans from the from the Carolinas all the way to Louisiana and a little bit of Texas as well. And Georgia, literally, it reflects the belt across the state of Georgia where those where the Black Belt can be seen. And poverty is particularly high in those communities. We know that over time, poverty has not been dramatically reduced. It certainly hasn't been eliminated, as you all know very well from the work that you do. Despite stubborn poverty rates, programs and services like TANF have not been able to deliver on its promise to help people move into more economically secure circumstances. Since the 1990s, the late 1990s, whenever the TANF program was established, the poverty rate has largely remained the same, while people have been pushed off of TANF almost to the extreme at a rate that is, pretty phenomenal compared to participation prior to 1996, whenever the welfare reform law was signed into law nationally. And I'll get into some of that later in the presentation, but just want to highlight here that poverty is persistent in our state. And it's persistent, particularly for kids of color and families of color. And while the rate has not changed, the programs that are supposed to help deliver relief to families have not been able to deliver on that promise. Additionally, and this is actually an outdated graphic, and I thought I switched it out, but the pandemic has really exploded economic hardship, particularly for people of color, families of color in Georgia. And throughout this period, we've seen various forms of economic relief provided to families, but a lot of that relief actually bypassed those who are in deep poverty as well. For that matter, in that manner, a lot of these families have not been able to access, unemployment benefits because they've had inconsistent work histories, for example. So they weren't able to get the enhanced unemployment insurance. And because of issues like that around eligibility, a lot of people also couldn't turn to TANF when they fell on hard times over the last year. So essentially, the pandemic served as an event that really catalyzed and accelerated some of the racial inequities within our safety net system, largely within our economy, showing that those families are going to have the most difficulty recovering over the next couple of years. Historically, and the next few slides are going to get into some of the history behind cash assistance, or TANF, and I'll speak to AFDC, which is TANF's predecessor. But historically, TANF is considered a race-neutral, colorblind, or race-blind policy because it doesn't explicitly address race, right? It doesn't name the histories of racism within our welfare system that extend way back into the early 1900s. So this is a quote that I really appreciate from Shannon Monette, who talks about the ways that racial colorblindness can help policies act in very stealth ways to reproduce racial disadvantage, particularly for Black and Latinx folks and women of color, for sure. And there will be some examples around how that's mediated through stereotypes about certain people who do turn to the social safety net, who do turn to cash assistance to make ends meet. So I'm gonna share this video, just a short clip, about a minute and some seconds. And I'll need somebody to throw a thumbs up to make sure that you can hear it. Let me see.
Ronald Reagan really took it to the next level when he ran for president in 80 and 84. And he had this story he would tell on the stump. It was part of his stump speech.
In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names.
Names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits. And so it was this whole image of someone abusing the system and in fact getting rich and living luxurious.
You don't ever have to really use kind of racial terms. That kind of language in and of itself evokes kind of this racial resentment.
Welfare is to help those who are the neediest of the needy, and not to bring in children to the world they cannot care for.
Section 8 rental vouchers. Medicaid, free health care while I'm paying up the wazoo for health insurance. The parasites outnumber the producers.
This guy is a parasite. And my contention is that the Obama administration is encouraging parasites to come out.
With welfare reform that took place in 1996, it fundamentally changed what states could do and have a lot of discretion in how they determined who was eligible. And the system became much more punitive. It actually denied a lot of eligible folks resources.
Today we are ending welfare as we know it. We all know that the typical family on welfare today is very different from the one that welfare was designed to deal with 60 years ago.
So I will stop that video there. This is actually a video produced by the Economic Security Project. And whenever we share the slides after this, you can view the full video, which I think is a great summary of the myth of the welfare queen and how its journey from Reagan to Clinton helped inform the TANF program that we see today, which is the topic of the report that we're discussing. Let me see how to work this.
I think people have been fighting.
Okay. So going back, staying on the topic of history, make sure I'm on the, staying on the topic of history, you know, every time there have been programs that have tried to provide direct cash support to families, there have been roadblocks to that are largely ideological and tied to narratives about dependency, about culture of poverty, really pathological ideas about people who turn to help whenever they are on hard times. This is a clipping from an article from the 1970s that is really interesting because it highlights a proposal from President Nixon, who was actually a proponent of a guaranteed income, a direct cash program for families that ended up getting scraped by Congress because the position of most members at the time, certainly within the party, was that in order to receive cash assistance, people need to be working. You can't just provide handouts to folks, because if you provide handouts, then people aren't going to work. And that is a narrative that has been articulated over decades and decades and decades, and is even very prominent today. I hear it often when we listen to people talk about the extended unemployment insurance benefits, right? It's the reason people won't come back to work is because they're, you know, getting a sweetener from the added benefits through unemployment, which is a largely false idea if anyone understands kind of the rules of unemployment insurance and how that particular program works. But I digress. That narrative, that culture of dependency discourse is very pervasive and ends up worsening opportunities for people who need help to actually get the help that they need. Going back a little bit further into the history, within Georgia has a very interesting history with cash assistance. We actually became one of the first states to, at the state level, approve a very draconian law known as the family cap for cash benefits. And essentially what the family cap required was that if you are a woman who's receiving cash assistance, and at the time it was aid to families with dependent children, then you cannot get additional aid if you have more children. And this was rooted in a stereotype that women were having babies just so they can get cash assistance, just so they could essentially leech off the system, or as the folks in the video described participants as act as parasites, essentially. The governor in the 1950s approved that family cap law, and I have a quote here from the, decades ago, the Department of Public Welfare supporting that law, noting statistics that weren't largely unfounded around illegitimacy within Black families to underscore the need for the family cap, claiming that family cap would halt a growing tendency to produce illegitimate children as a good business. And eventually, and this was, alarming to me, is saving the state $440,000 annually. This law at the time was so extreme that whenever it was submitted to the federal government, the feds actually said, no, you can't institute a family cap at the time. Think about that. That was in the 1950s. Shortly after, though, well, not shortly after, but a few decades later, Governor Zell Miller in the early 1990s worked with the legislature and devised a family cap again. And the family cap actually became one of the first, not the first, but one of the first to be approved and it became law at the state level. And then Newt Gingrich, who was Speaker of the House in the early 1990s, took the idea to the welfare reform conversations at the national level. And then by 1996, the family cap became an actual national policy, largely built off of its legacy here in Georgia. It's one of the most egregious and most explicitly racist components of TANF today, and I'll share later, but we're actively working to get that repealed. I have to also add that law is it's an option for states. Not all states had to implement a family cap. Georgia did implement it, and most states that did implement it have already repealed the law, and we're a little behind the game on that, but we're working on getting it repealed. Besides those regulatory or policy choices, during the time of in the mid 20th century and sort of the late 20th century too, racial terrorism actually served as a way to restrict access to cash assistance in the state of Georgia. And this slide here provides some notes from a report from the federal government who had to actually investigate racial terror in one of Georgia's counties, in Webster County, where people were being terrorized for showing up to the local county welfare offices, which would be the equivalent to our local DFACS offices today, and asking for assistance. Particularly, this was specifically for Black folks showing up, asking for welfare, and rural white folks not liking that, just as they would react to Black folks showing up to the voting booths at the same time. So a very complicated, very horrific history when it comes to cash in Georgia, when you look at the news headlines back in the day. And then, of course, like the video noted, and as I just noted with the family cap example, all of these things became baked into the 1996 welfare reform law, which President Clinton is here signing in this photo. And it is essentially the welfare law that we know today. This is TANF. TANF is welfare as we know it today. Let's see, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip through a little bit of this. I want to talk about some of the racialized features of TANF currently. Most states that have higher rates of people of color have the most restrictive TANF policies on the books. So Georgia's one of those states. Georgia has the third highest rate of Black residents in the entire country. And when we look at TANF policies, TANF rules, and compare that to Black populations, we're pretty much able to see clearly that the Blacker a state is, the more restrictive and difficult it is to access benefits. So Georgia's a leading state in that regard. You can see since 1996, the participation rates in TANF have declined very dramatically. This goes up until 2018. But as of 2018, only 5 out of every 100 families that are in poverty are actually able to get access to direct cash support through temporary assistance for needy families. That's compared to 82 out of 100 families that were receiving assistance up until the time that TANF was signed into law. This is just a slide on the TANF block grant itself, and I go into detail on how the funding block grant operates. It is a block grant, so states have options to use it however they see fit, as long as they can make a case that it meets the goals of the program. And you can see here, this little carve out for basic cash assistance is very small. Since the 1990s, we've spent less and less of our TANF dollars on actually providing direct cash assistance. Instead, we've used our TANF block grant to backfill state budget holes for other programs and services, because we have not been generating new revenue to support critical state services like child welfare, like foster care and adoption, and others. States that do value those programs and services do raise state general fund dollars. They don't siphon off federal TANF dollars to support those programs. And then here, this is might be a little difficult to read, but spending on direct cash assistance through TANF has also gone down at the same time that child poverty rates have somewhat increased and stayed relatively high. Again, TANF is supposed to address child poverty, supposed to lift families and particularly children above the poverty line. And then there's the TANF benefit amount itself. So I know a lot of people are probably like, well, how much is it? I mean, is it even worth it? Frankly, that's part of the recipe for discouraging people from accessing the benefit, is to keep the benefit as low as possible. Currently, the TANF cash amount is $280 per month for a family of 3. It has been $280 per month for a family of 3 for over 30 years, since it was AFDC. It has not changed. So again, in this chart, you can see if we were to calculate what the benefit amount would be now, controlling for inflation, the value of that cash benefit is only $149 per month. So it's lost a significant amount of its value, over $100. And again, we're working on getting this increased because 30 years is far too much, far too long to make families, go through all those hoops for this very meager benefit amount. In terms of the racialized nature of it, and it's the difficulty of making it more accessible for families of color, and particularly for Black women, we wanted to highlight how TANF plays a role in the finances of the lives of women, because TANF largely serves mothers predominantly. So here you can see that Black women are largely drawing on public assistance as a form of income, in addition to their TANF assistance, while white women are able to combine TANF with other forms of outside cash income, support from families, and other forms of support, which goes to show, the limited amount of assets that Black women are able to bring into their households and grow their assets while they're receiving cash benefits through TANF. Getting into some of the racist barriers really quickly, work requirements is one of the most well-known racist components of the policy itself. The history of work requirements is also very extensive and doesn't only apply to TANF, it also applies to SNAP, it applies to Medicaid, which has been proposed in various states over recent years, but has been struck down by the courts because they don't meet the goals of Medicaid, forcing people to find work just so they can get health coverage if they fall within the coverage gap is just shy of cruel, if not actually cruel. But again, the history there is tied to a longer history of racism and really resentment towards Black women. And this is a clipping from a paper from 1918 in South Carolina, where the local city council was looking to impose a work requirement for Black women. And the work requirement was so punitive that if people weren't finding work, if women weren't able to find work, then they were willing to actually incarcerate these women for being unemployed. This was ultimately a ploy or a strategy to force Black women back into the homes of middle-class and wealthy white folks who needed caregivers to care for their families, for their children, et cetera. So it was a way to also reproduce some of that servitude that largely stemmed from slavery in the post-Reconstruction servitude that we saw in the decades to follow. So pretty complicated history there. I talked about the family cap already, being a pretty explicit one. Asset limits are a big one. So you can only own about $1,000 worth in assets in order to receive cash assistance in Georgia through TANF. Most states either have no asset limit at all or have increased it substantially. It's counter to the goals of TANF, to increase economic opportunity whenever you're only allowed to hold $1,000 or so in your savings. You can't save, you can't grow your wealth, et cetera. There's a drug felony ban. If you have a drug felony on your record, you have a lifetime ban from receiving cash assistance, which is also counter to the goals of TANF, because if you are re-entering society and you need help to get back on your feet and you can't turn to the social safety net to help you during that time, then that is counter to I think what re-entry is really about, right? Also, there's this emphasis on personal responsibility, and the reason why re-entering folks turn to TANF is so that they can also address their social and emotional needs, acting on personal responsibility, and instead of rewarding that, TANF currently punishes that behavior. So SNAP, for food stamps, we have repealed that ban a few years ago, so you can receive food stamps now if you have a drug felony history. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do the same thing for TANF. And then there's also a federal ban on immigrant eligibility for cash assistance. This is obviously another one that's very egregious and very explicitly racist. It's a very explicit form of discrimination within the program. All undocumented immigrants are barred from receiving cash assistance from federal TANF funds. It's not listed here. Georgia has a very, very, very small program that's funded using state dollars that does allow legal permanent residents, documented immigrants to receive some form of cash assistance, but undocumented immigrants are not eligible for assistance. It's cruel in the sense that a lot of children live in households with parents who are undocumented, a lot of US born children, and they could benefit from assistance, but because of the ban, they don't. And even in cases where they may be eligible, they don't seek out assistance because of what's referred to as a chilling effect, because of things like public charge and other really punitive measures that penalize immigrants from seeking social support or social safety net support because it could impact their citizenship in the US. So I won't go through all these because I'm over my 30 minutes, I think, but the solutions are to just get rid of all of those things that I just mentioned. Basically, reimagining TANF means repealing all of those really awful components of the program and the policy that I just mentioned: the family cap, repealing the asset limit, repealing the drug felony ban, making all immigrants, immigrant newcomers eligible for assistance whenever they need it, making sure that we're fully funding, I have a list here, making sure that we're using all of our TANF dollars to provide cash assistance for those who are in poverty, increasing the max benefit amount, which again has been the same for over 30 years now. Basically, turning the program and the policy upside down is the solution. And all of these options are options, with the exception of the immigrant ban, all of these options are options that the state of Georgia can pursue on its own through legislative action. Doesn't require federal action. The reason why our TANF program features all of these racist components or generally problematic features is because of decisions made by our state legislators and in others, you know, a longer history of folks in executive leadership in the state of Georgia. It's time to reverse all of those decisions that have unfortunately made cash assistance completely out of reach for those who need it the most. So I end the report noting that there is one big bold solution, and it's one that's been historically debated and has reached, you know, as far as the congressional level, and that's the solution of a basic income with no strings attached. I think that's kind of where we see a vision for folks who are interested in eliminating poverty, and Dr. King is quoted here as a visionary who understood that very well. And obviously we see now that the topic is coming up again. So there are various pilots that are providing guaranteed income to families. There's the Stockton experiment in California. There's the Magnolia Mothers Trust in Mississippi. There's a pilot that's growing here in Georgia in the Old Fourth Ward community through the Old Fourth Ward Task Force. And there are several others all across the country. And they're all based on this value that the best way to lift families above poverty is just to provide direct support to folks. We mobilized our federal government multiple times over the last year to do that. You know, millions of people woke up and found direct cash relief in their bank accounts overnight in some cases. Imperfect because it bypassed communities, again, it bypassed immigrant communities in particular. So that needs to be addressed. But what it shows is that something big and bold is absolutely possible. And the results of that are very compelling when you look at how much it's boosted health outcomes for families. It's boosted work and income opportunities because despite popular belief, it does not reduce people, it does not reduce employment among people who do receive assistance. And later this year, we'll start seeing direct recurring payments to families through the American Rescue Plan. For those who don't know, the child tax credit is basically going to provide basic income to families who are eligible. And the results from, you know, for families that we will see from that, I think are going to be spectacular and make the case even more for Dr. King's vision here. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and open it up. I know we have some breakout opportunity as well. So
yeah, so we're gonna do some quick breakouts where we hope you guys will unmute yourselves, turn your videos on, have some quick discussion. This is a big group that's intended to be people who are serving and working with children and family in the state of Georgia. So I know it's not that we don't care, it's that we don't always know. And I didn't grow up learning this history or about these policies either. And to know more about them and to see them is to be able to change them. So we're gonna do our first breakout. It's gonna be a quick 5 minutes. And then we'll bring us back together, have some discussion, do one more. And so be ready with your questions for Alex when we get to the end. But I just put in the chat box. Oh, that was the waiting room chat box. So I put the question and the link to the article again. So the first question for the breakout rooms is, what barriers to public assistance most surprised you that is still going on in the nation, in our state of Georgia, and how this impacts the families that we are all directly serving? So I have that in the chat box for you guys to refer back to, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that everyone was brave and unmuted, put their camera on to join in this discussion. And we would love just to hear any groups want to chime in to answer the question, what barriers did you guys find the most surprising and how would it impact families that you work with? So feel free to put in the chat box or unmute.
Well, this is Laura. I'll share from our group. We were all very surprised. I think the majority of us, probably all of us, at the $280 not having changed, and the fact that I can't build any wealth. I have to stay under $1,000 in any assets. The drug charges keeping me from being able to get assistance if I'm in that. And there were some other things. And one thing that really hit home with me was no wonder Georgia is ranked 38th in child well-being if this is how we are treating these families. And I'm sure maybe I forgot something. So anybody else in my group, please chime in.
Thank you, Laura.
In our group, Rose and Richard brought up the fact that inflation is not accounted for TANF stipends, which is not the case for, especially as Richard brought up, like retirement, pension, etc.
And I'm seeing in the chat box, people are agreeing that the $280 has not changed in 30 years. I see a good question. Does that $1,000 asset limit include the equity you have in your vehicle and or home?
So it doesn't include the vehicle, but for the home, I think there is a limit, but I'm not completely sure. Let me follow up and get an answer on that.
I guess I'll speak for our group. And also, I just want to say this hits a very personal note for me because I am a former welfare recipient in the state of Georgia, so I can relate to all of these issues directly. You know, the stigma, we talked about the stigma that has historically been in place around, you know, welfare recipients and the welfare system in general throughout this country. We also talked about how, you know, this is on a case-by-case basis, but along with that, the persona or the attitude of the workers, you know, who you go to for government assistance, how they don't always want to help you, you know, or they don't want to be there. They're not as, you know, happy to assist you with your needs for whatever reason. And then also just the protocols that are in place or not in place in terms of when you have to submit your paperwork, the turnaround time. And obviously, if there's other things that you're dealing with in terms of not having housing, or you're unemployed, or you don't speak English as a first language, all these things are added to those barriers. And quite honestly, I'm just speaking for myself and most of my group, we're not surprised at all about the barriers. I mean, this has been in place for quite some time. I know firsthand that, you know, all these things that keep, you know, the African American community and other people of color at bay, it's been like this for quite some time.
Thank you for sharing, Solida, and lifting your voice to that, to have those barriers. And then I think it's a good point on the workforce side that many people in that workforce are also experiencing some degree of poverty, and then to be serving those, to be surrounded by that trauma and what that produces in there.
Yeah, my reaction to that is, and I think as you pointed out, is that that's a lot of those those hoops that folks have to jump through are intentional, right? That's how we got from the 82 in every 100 families in poverty to the 5 in every 100 families in poverty receiving TANF. You know, in real-time example, you know, some of you may be familiar with Georgia Gateway, and it's our integrated eligibility system for public benefits. Prior to last year, May of last year, you couldn't apply for TANF through Gateway, which online from home. You had to, you know, physically go to your county defects office, or you had to go through a telephonic process, or you had to mail in an application and go wait for that process. It wasn't until months and months into the pandemic that they actually made the application accessible online. Mind you, DFACS offices were physically closed prior to that because of the pandemic. So, you know, all that to say is just underscores, you know, the intentionality, the policy choices that, you know, that exists. So I appreciate you, reflecting on that experience with the paperwork and everything, because that is very real.
Okay. And we're going to do one more quick breakout room. This one's going to be just a little bit shorter. And I'm putting the question in the chat box now. So the next question is, what could be done to help reduce policies and practices rooted in racism and stereotypes? And what can be done to promote the equality of these practices? So not only to be undone, but to further promote equity in these policies and practices. Or even if you want to say what's one thing that you could do or your organization could do, some of the small steps to get there as well. So I just put that in the chat box, and we'll see you in like 3 to 4 minutes. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you for sticking around for our kind of more intimate discussions around this. And we would love to hear from a couple of you guys just what you thought could be done to kind of change or reduce these policies rooted in racism or stereotypes or practices, especially if it's something you feel like you could step up or do your organization or even as a collective. So I'd love to hear you guys unmute or put it in the chat box.
My group had a really good discussion. We stated that we feel like it could definitely start with the House and the Senate. Like there should be an age cap on how long they can retain their seats or a term limit. I feel that more millennials should definitely be making these decisions besides old white men, because that's who's making the decisions. So I feel like, once that is accomplished, then it'll be good, because as long as they're in there, they're just going to do what's been done, because they're really big on tradition. So, that's the way to start at the root of the problem.
So starting by having more representation in people who are in decision-making seats.
And Joe, we talked about in our group is walking alongside families, advocating for them, advocating with them, connecting a name. I know with COVID, I'm not sure what's happening with DFACs, but just trying to advocate on behalf of that family and connecting them with someone versus trying to send them and have them out there on their own, but just walk beside them with this process.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And that also helps people who are service providers who might not be as intimately acquainted with TANF or applying for benefits see what the process is like firsthand, and also, help advocate for that once you see it. I know I'm not in direct service, so it's harder for me to understand the true hurdles and barriers. So I appreciate others lifting their voice to that and having service providers go directly.
If I could jump in real quick, this is Heather Lee. And one of the things that occurred to me, but I didn't get a chance to bring up in our group, was looking at it from the opposite side and reducing the amount of stigma through exposure. For example, I can say, yes, when I was younger, my family was on welfare, and I very distinctly remember that my mom was just mortified that we had to actually be on that way. But I'm the child of 2 military parents, and military pay is really not much. So with a large family. But I realized as I was going through that, I was almost afraid to say that, because there's a stigma that surrounds being on that social support, which is stupid. And that's something that can be addressed to kind of attack it from another angle, I think.
Yeah, I love it, because many of the voices that are most marginalized, there's a lot of shame taught around poverty. So why would you step up to advocate about something that is shameful, that we teach is shameful? So how do we help others advocate to just have a lot of firsthand knowledge to change it? So thank you so much, Heather, for sharing that with us. I'm looking in the chat box.
It's really interesting to see that this seems to be a theme, because our group talked about that too, of needing people to be at the table, who have received welfare and, who have had personal lived experience in all these systems. We didn't speak about the legislative table specifically, but just policy-making tables and agencies, because you don't want public policy to be something that is done to people. I'm still cringing over referring to people as parasites in that video.
Yeah, I'll say to that, I 100% agree. The legislative process isn't designed to invite people who are directly impacted into the process, right? I mean, it's 40 days and 40 nights. It begins and ends in the blink of an eye here in Georgia. The committee hearings are very, unprogrammed and often not, accessible. And if cases that they are accessible, you have to have internet access. And then quite frankly, you look at our capital and navigating to downtown, it's hard to get down to the Capitol. You have to pay for parking if you're not taking public transportation. You have to pay for public transportation. And then, from a racialized perspective, it's also traumatizing and triggering because there are a lot of Confederate monuments around the Capitol. It's not a very inclusive environment either. So one of the ways that we try to, as an advocate, invite folks into the discussion and into the policy debate is by going with them to the Capitol to testify, pre-COVID, when we were felt comfortable physically going, or incorporating their stories in our research. So in the report, there's a quote from a directly impacted participant who shared her perspective on the program. But to all of those points, it is an incredibly unwelcoming experience for folks who are participants themselves. And I imagine a world where we can break that up and be more inviting to folks so that they can inform the process, because the people making the decisions we're never in proximity to those who did turn to TANF or food stamps or Medicaid or other programs.
Alex, to your point, and part of the discussion that my group had is these policies were created by white men before minorities and immigrants and African Americans who were slaves at the time were in their thought processes, and they were designed to uplift poor white families, or just the whole structure was built around white America, if you will. And the changes over time have come into play often to ensure that if they saw a minority group being lifted up, they would change some of the policies to ensure that they didn't get lifted up too high and have that seat at the table. So unfortunately, like the title of this session is, Racism is Baked In, it was inherently baked in for a specific target audience. And as more people access those policies, they started making changes to try and exclude more of them from being lifted up entirely too much. So we still have a lot of policies. And what we talked about is it has to be almost like all of the other structures we're having these societal issues and conversations about the last year and a half or so, being torn down and rebuilt as a collective country, United States of America, and everything that we bring to the table as a multiracial melting pot. So that's how the conversation has to be addressed, and that's why everyone needs a seat at the table, and that's why we need to have term limits to get rid of some of these people that's been in power for 40, 50, 60 years, and before them it was another member of their family and another member of their family, and they're trying to keep it the status quo to ensure they stay in power, or a relative form of that. The Georgia voting policies that were implemented recently are all geared around ensuring that certain people stay in power because they're feeling uncomfortable that they may lose their power as they see the shift in demographics. So, we have to have that conversation as part of all the other conversations.
Yeah, I would, thank you for that. I would relate again to the kind of history around racial terrorism for folks that were trying to get benefits from their local welfare office in Southwest Georgia, to the same discrimination and terrorism that happened to folks who were trying to vote. I think the relationship between democracy and access to our general economic welfare and economic security are inextricably linked in that regard. And then two, I agree 100% that dismantling the system and the policy itself is a requirement as we think about how to reimagine this like what's needed to help people thrive. And I admit the solutions that I named in the report and in this presentation are piecemeal solutions only designed or developed to reverse the current policy. And that's why we talk about guaranteed income as a potential like big, bold next step. If we were to replace TANF, you know, and this is the question that, you know, I would love to leave you all with, and it's part of the national discussion too, again, with all of the direct payments that are being made to families as a result of the pandemic. You know, if we got rid of TANF, which I'm okay with doing, what do we replace it with? Is it guaranteed income? Is it something else? And knowing what we know about the restrictive barriers that have a really troubling history, how do we get to a no strings attached approach that don't you know, as opposed to the current approach that disproportionately hurts and harms people, kids, and families of color. So, yeah.
Thank you, Alex. And I just want to, as a closing, thank you everyone so much for your participation and engagement with us today. And sometimes it might feel like, well, why is Prevent Child Abuse Georgia bringing these subjects? Because we envision a world where children don't even get to child welfare system. The child welfare system is totally eradicated. So that's what primary prevention is. And what it's going to take is policies that are able to support families, support individuals, and the belief that everyone is deserving, not some. So we believe that everyone is deserving, no matter the circumstance. We want them to be healthy, happy, thriving, and especially for our families in the state of Georgia. So thank you again to Alex. I'm posting the evaluation link in the chat box right now, which is where you will get the survey, once you take the survey, you will get an automatic certificate of attendance if you need it. The slides and recording will be posted on our website later today, so you can check back there. So thank you everyone so much. And if you didn't read the article, go back and read it. We covered just one policy. Some of it might have opened our eyes. For others, it's what you have lived every day and have seen it. But check out the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute website so you can see a lot of different policies that they cover and have examined with especially a racial equity lens in there. So thank you everyone and have a good one.
Thank you all so much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.